Welcome back to the Vybrational Stage Podcast. This week we began with a simple but deeply familiar experience, the feeling that life is pulling us in too many directions at once. At first it appeared to be a conversation about overwhelm, too many responsibilities, too many commitments, too many unfinished tasks, too many demands competing for our attention. But as we've explored this experience together, something deeper has gradually emerged. Perhaps the problem was never simply the number of directions pulling at us. Perhaps the deeper issue is that different versions of ourselves are being pulled in different directions at the same time. The achiever wants one thing, the protector wants another, the provider wants another, the dreamer wants another, the fearful self wants another. And somewhere in the middle of those competing voices, we begin losing contact with ourselves. Today, as we conclude this week's journey, I want to explore a possibility that has the power to change everything. What if the version of you that learned how to survive has quietly become the one running your life? The survival self. Every human being develops strategies for navigating life. Some of those strategies are obvious. Others are so deeply woven into our identity that we no longer recognize them as strategies at all. The child who learned that achievement created approval may become the adult who never stops striving. The child who learned that mistakes brought criticism may be the adult who chases perfection. The child who learned that vulnerability felt unsafe may become the adult who never asks for help. The child who learned that stability was uncertain may become the adult who feels responsible for controlling every possible outcome. None of these adaptations are wrong. In fact, many of them are brilliant. They helped us survive. They helped us navigate difficult situations. They helped us protect ourselves. They helped us find our place in the world. The problem isn't that these strategies exist. The problem arises when we continue operating from them long after the original conditions have disappeared. Because what helps us survive one season of life may limit us in another. When survival becomes identity. One of the strangest things about being human is how easily we forget that our coping mechanisms are not who we are. Over time, survival strategies stop feeling like strategies. They start feeling like identity. The achiever no longer feels like a role. It feels like who we are. The responsible one no longer feels like a role. It feels like who we are. The strong one, the fixer, the caregiver, the provider, the rescuer, the person who always has it together, the person who always knows what to do, the person who never struggles. Eventually, we stop playing the role and begin believing we are the role. And that is where things become exhausting, because every role requires maintenance. Every role carries expectations. Every role creates pressure. Every role demands energy. And if we're carrying enough roles for long enough, eventually life begins to feel heavy. Not because we're weak, but because we're carrying more identities than any human being was ever meant to carry. The exhaustion nobody talks about. When most people think about exhaustion, they think about lack of sleep, too much work, stress, busy schedules, and certainly those things matter. But there's another form of exhaustion that is rarely discussed. Identity exhaustion. The exhaustion that comes from spending years maintaining a version of yourself that no longer feels true. Think about how much energy it takes to constantly prove your worth, to constantly demonstrate competence, to constantly meet expectations, to constantly be available, to constantly be strong, to constantly have the answers, to constantly hold everything together. At some point, the soul begins asking a question. How much longer can I keep carrying this? Not because you're incapable, not because you're failing, but because life is asking you to evolve. and evolution often begins with recognizing what no longer fits. The cost of never updating the story. Many people continue living according to rules they created decades ago. Rules that once served an important purpose. Rules that once protected them. Rules that once made sense. But rules that no longer reflect who they are becoming. Perhaps your internal rule says, I must always be productive. I must never disappoint anyone. I must always be available. I must always have the answers. I must always stay in control. I must always be strong. The challenge is that these rules often operate beneath awareness. We don't consciously choose them. We simply obey them. And every time we obey a rule that no longer serves us, we move a little further away from ourselves. The result is often a strange kind of success. We achieve the goals, we meet the expectations, we check the boxes, yet somehow we feel disconnected. Because while our life may be growing, our authenticity may be shrinking. Why we feel pulled in so many directions. This brings us to the core problem we've been exploring all week. Why do we feel pulled in so many directions? Because every identity is pulling. The achiever wants success. The provider wants security. The caretaker wants everyone to be okay. The perfectionist wants certainty. The fearful self wants protection. The dreamer wants possibility. The exhausted self wants rest. And because we rarely recognize these competing forces, we assume life itself is pulling us apart. But often the struggle is internal. Multiple identities are competing for control, and every one of them believes it's helping. That realization changes everything. Because once we see the competing forces clearly, we no longer have to obey them automatically. We can begin choosing consciously. The freedom hidden beneath the pressure. This week's deepest insight may be surprisingly simple. What if nothing is wrong? What if overwhelm isn't evidence of failure? What if overwhelm is a signal that something has become unnecessarily complicated? A signal that you've been trying to become someone instead of simply being yourself. Perhaps the exhaustion isn't asking you to push harder. Perhaps it's asking you to let go. Not of responsibility, not of commitment, not of purpose, but of unnecessary weight. The weight of old expectations, the weight of outdated stories, the weight of identities you've already outgrown. What this week has revealed. As we bring this conversation to a close, let's look at the journey we've taken together. We began by identifying the competing directions pulling at our attention. We explored how overwhelm often comes from trying to manage too many variables simultaneously. We examined the identities competing for control of our lives. And now we arrive at a deeper understanding. The goal is not to perfectly manage every demand. The goal is not to become more productive. The goal is not to become a better performer. The goal is clarity. The goal is self-leadership. The goal is recognizing what truly matters and allowing everything else to take its proper place. That is where freedom begins. This week's Vibe Shift blog experience. Throughout this week, the Vibe Shift blog has been building a practical framework alongside our deeper conversations here on the Vibrational Stage. What began with identifying the competing directions pulling at your attention has gradually evolved into a complete roadmap for navigating overwhelm, reducing unnecessary complexity, and reconnecting with what truly matters. Today's final blog installment reveals the complete framework and brings all of this week's insights together into a practical self-empowerment process. More importantly, it serves as the foundation of the upcoming VSP number 4, Immersive Experience, where we will take these concepts beyond understanding and into lived experience. Beyond the Journey, the Vibe Shift blog. You can follow the link in the show notes. Questions, insights, or reflections? You can reach out to us at vibeshiftconnect@gmail.com. Again, the link is in the show notes. Final reflection. Maybe the version of you that survived deserves gratitude. Maybe it helped you through seasons you never thought you would make it through. Maybe it carried you when life felt impossible. Maybe it protected you when protection was necessary. Maybe it taught you lessons that still matter today. But perhaps it no longer deserves complete control. Because survival and living are not the same thing. And there comes a point when life invites us to stop asking, how do I keep surviving? And start asking, how do I begin fully living? Perhaps that invitation is what you've been hearing all week. Not an invitation to become someone new. Not an invitation to fix yourself. Not an invitation to optimize yourself. But an invitation to remember yourself. To reconnect with a part of you that existed before the pressure, before the expectations, before the performance, before the endless striving. Because beneath all of those layers is something that has never been broken, something that has never needed improvement, something that has never been lost. You. And perhaps the greatest act of self-empowerment is finally giving yourself permission to come home. Thank you for joining me this week on the Vybrational Stage Podcast. Until next time, remember, you do not have to become someone else to discover your worth. You only have to remember who you already are.